Welcome to Hard Knocks, the news talk show that brings you the most relevant and controversial issues in politics today. We have all heard about the impending fiscal cliff, but what is it exactly? What should be done about this potential disaster? I have brought you 3 experts with very different answers to that question so that you can get the full story: a deficit hawk, a deficit dove, and a deficit owl. But before we hear from these experts, let me give you a little background on the much feared and debated fiscal cliff. On January 1, 2013, if no deal is reached, there will be a combination of tax increases and spending cuts which will affect over 1,000 government programs, including the defense budget, Medicaid, and Medicare. If allowed to proceed, the fiscal cliff policies will cut the national deficit of 2013 in half and further reduce it over the next 10 years by as much as $7.1 trillion, or about 70%. Let's hear about what should be done regarding the fiscal cliff from the deficit hawk first. The hawk is here to argue on behalf of fiscal conservatives on both sides of the congressional aisle who are concerned with the federal deficit, claiming that it must be addressed before all else.
Thank you, moderator. The fiscal cliff is a drastic measure that would cut our budget deficit in half. Not all of it is good, though the budget deficit is the major problem of today. It is crucial that we all make some hard sacrifices to get this nation's budget under control, just like every household is doing right now in these trying economic times. We can't keep going down this unsustainable path, leaving a future of debt for our children to pay off. Paying for programs like Social Security and Medicare for an aging population is simply something we cannot afford, and it is our moral duty to reduce the deficit.
Thank you, Hawk. Now let's hear from the deficit dove, here to argue for politicians who wish to preserve our public programs, even if it means reducing the deficit at a slower rate. You will only hear this perspective from a few daring liberals up on Capitol Hill.
I agree that deficits are bad, though only in the long term. We need to fear having a deficit that is too high, but right now the economy is far too fragile to withstand too many tax increases and cuts to social programs. The Congressional Budget Office says that if Washington partakes in austerity measures, the economy will experience a double-dip recession. We cannot afford that right now. Let us wait until the economy is stronger before tackling the deficit head-on.
Thank you, Dove. The owl prioritizes the overall health of the economy, arguing that the deficit-reducing measures proposed by the hawks and doves will actually harm our economy. An interesting perspective. The fiscal cliff is a combination of tax increases and cuts to social programs. This is called austerity, which is the exact opposite of what the economy needs right now. Increasing taxes and reducing government spending will do nothing but harm the slowly recovering economy. What needs to happen is either a reduction in taxes, an increase in government spending, or better yet, some of both.
So, you don't think deficits are problematic?
I do think deficits can be a problem if they are too big, because they can cause what's called demand pull inflation, which is a term economists use to describe inflation that happens as a result of too many dollars chasing too few goods. However, this type of inflation only happens when the government continues to spend when the economy is already running at full employment. This is far from the current reality.
But we are broke. Even Obama has said we are out of money.
Yes, Huck. We must run the economy like a household. Spending big on our means is irresponsible.
Actually, you are both misunderstood. The government has the power to create money and can never run out, unless of course you politicians vote for this. It is unsustainable for a household to spend beyond its means for an extended period of time. But there is a fundamental difference between a currency issuer and a currency user. After all, households can just create legal tender. The two of you are living in a gold standard world when in fact we live in a monetary economy with fiat currency. The federal government can create money for the purpose of creating jobs. And this can be done in a fiscally responsible way. The only thing stopping the government from reducing unemployment is Congress's ignorance of how a modern economy works. In reality, deficits are a mainstay in a monetary economy.
So, you are saying that taxes are not used to finance government spending?
No, taxes are no more than a method for maintaining demand for fiat money. Taxes give value to money, So it's not that taxes can be totally disregarded. Taxing in order for the government to spend is a common misunderstanding. In fact, deficit spending is a necessary component for combating demand leakages. The economy can be split into three different pieces: the domestic government sector, the domestic private sector, which includes both households and firms, and the foreign sector, which captures all foreign trade. No matter what, spending by the government is exactly equal to the combined surplus the other two sectors. When I say exact, I mean to the dollar. These three sectors must account for every dollar spent in a country. This means that when the government spends on so-called entitlements, its deficit is the surplus of the non-governmental sectors. The current trade deficit can be thought of as a leakage from the domestic sectors and a surplus to our foreign trade partners. The balancing surplus shows up in the domestic economy as the goods and services that we've purchased from abroad. This creates a deficiency in aggregate demand for domestic goods and services. Either the private sector or the government sector must make up this demand for our economy to grow. The private sector is unwilling to do that right now because of poor future profit expectations, thus the government should step in and fill the gap.
Well, if the government was to spend more and have some kind of job program, that would definitely be inflationary. Think about all these people having to eat. That will drive prices way up.
Yeah. And what if they want to buy a pair of shoes too? Or pay rent or something?
So your major objection for the government maintaining full employment through some kind of government spending is there will be inflation from people eating or buying shoes or paying rent. Even if this was inflationary, which would only happen at more than full employment, by the way, you are objecting to a person putting food on the table as a result of their own labor. But that's right, you both think government spending leads directly to inflation. Unemployment has serious economic consequences not only for the jobless but the economy as a whole. Bill Mitchell estimates that each day the economy loses $10 billion per day of lost output when looking at potential and real gross domestic product. If your fear of inflation outweighs someone working to feed themselves, then you politicians have skewed priorities about what this country needs.
Well then, if the government's budget isn't constrained like a household's, what should the grand bargain entail? Is a long-term reduction program, say 10 years down the road, even necessary?
I think we need some serious debt reduction over the next 10 years. I'd say somewhere in the ballpark of $4 trillion. Yeah, that seems like a decent amount to keep the bond vigilantes happy.
The debt-to-GDP ratio must be stabilized over the next decade, but not nearly as much as $4 trillion. We think that $2 trillion is sufficient for making our long-term debt-to-GDP ration sustainable. If the debt ratio was too high, then international credit markets might not lend to the U.S. public or private sectors at a decent interest rate. This would happen if the debt ratio became too large.
The question isn't about how much to reduce debt over the next decade because of some perceived risk of these so-called bond vigilantes. It's really about maintaining full employment. There is no right amount of how much to reduce the debt ratio. People need jobs, and in a modern economy, deficits are necessary, more so during bad times than good. The deficit should be whatever amount is necessary for the economy to maintain full employment for all those people who are willing and able to work. The deficit shouldn't be more than what it takes to provide for full employment, though, since this can lead to inflation. But more importantly, when the deficit is too small, involuntary unemployment exists and poverty prevails. It is possible for the government to provide jobs in a fiscally responsible way without the risk of hyperinflation. Always remember, the government's deficit is the private sector's surplus. The grand bargain is at the expense of this country's citizens. It's not the grand bargain, it's the great betrayal.
My goodness, I truly have learned a whole lot today about the fiscal cliff. I learned that the government's deficit is the private sector's surplus. This means that reducing the deficit by tax increases or a decrease in government spending will hurt households and firms. I also learned that the government really isn't going broke, since it's not the case that tax revenues pay for government spending and since the government creates its own currency. Lastly, I learned that it is possible to have fiscal policy which provides jobs for people without being inflationary. I'm starting to think that politicians have a fundamental misunderstanding of the way the economy works, especially when it comes to this belief that austerity measures are what the US needs when in fact they are the exact opposite of what the economy needs during these low growth/high unemployment times. Thank you, Al, for clearing these things up.